Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss France and a speech that Emmanuel Macron just recently gave about Islam, as well as the Muslim world in general, speaking about the fact that Muslims within France, he said, are in crisis, but not just within France, but all over the world. As I said, saying, and I'm quoting him directly now, that Islam is a religion that is in crisis all over the world, and we are not just seeing this in our country, end quote. Now, he's proposed a bill as well, which expands on a 1905 law about the separation of church and state. Now, of course, we know that for the French, secularism is an extremely important ideology and value for them. And that in and of itself, of course, is fine, and no one's arguing with that. But then why target a specific religion and its adherents, i.e. the Muslims, who have been in France for many, many years, are contributing members of society as well? Now, this doesn't mean that Macron is the first one to speak about Islam and Muslims in this fashion. We've had, of course, just recently, in the past number of months, we've had a number of cases about, for example, an Algerian French girl who was, doing a video about a recipe online, and then she was, blasted for the fact that she was wearing a hijab as well. So let's discuss all of these issues a bit further with our esteemed guest, who is joining us this morning from Boston, Massachusetts. She is Dr. Jocelyne Cesari, who is a professor of religion and politics at the University of Birmingham. She's also a visiting professor at the Harvard Divinity School. Jocelyne, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of Macron's statement? For Muslims, they've felt, at least within France that I'm speaking about, they feel stigmatized because of that speech.
First, let's say that, as you mentioned, this is not the first time. Actually, you can trace back to the late 1980s, the attempt by the French state to regulate and control the expression of Islam in public space. What's called the headscarf affair started then and actually never ended until it was cemented or solidified into the law of 2004 that prohibits religious signs in public schools. And the controversy has been ongoing. It's about not only the dress code, but the gender relation in the public space, and so on. So in this particular angle, Macron's proposal is not so much, innovative. And the second perspective that explains his discourse is also the fact that there is a war on terror. And the French have also been very much at the forefront of controlling and regulating Islam in the name of security. Actually, for the French, it even started before 9/11, in 1995, when there was a bombing in the metro related to the civil war in Algeria. And the Vigipirate law, which is the equivalent of high security law, has been installed at this time and was never abolished and has been implemented since then. And at the time, I remember I was still in France. To carry a Quran could bring you to the police. So you see here there is not something new. What is new is the term he's using. This is the first time I hear that, which is separatism, which is a very heavy term, because it can also apply besides Islam to lots of other groups, like territorial minorities. This is serious in the sense that beyond the measure themselves, there is a symbolic here. Again, the targeting a particular religious group make it even more illegitimate in the national community.
But then, Jocelyne, I wonder, and of course you know this better than I do probably, that there are so many Muslims in France, and they've been there for enough generations now that they are very much part and parcel of society, and as French citizens, etc. Why now? Like, what do you see about the timing of all of this? And then what is the plan for the near future and the long-term future? I mean, is it to sideline the Muslims, or to just, try to, I don't know, have them further assimilate in ways that they may not even be comfortable in giving up their respective values and culture?
Why now? Multiple polling that have been done recently show that actually the majority of French agree with the opinion that Islam is a danger for the French national community. So it is a very easy, I would say, political move that to surf on this kind of opinions, and people and political actors before Macron have done that. In terms of restriction, I would like to say that sadly the surveys we have done show that these restrictions have been going on now for more than 20 years. Beyond the law against religious signs in public schools, the practice of every day in the public space, in administration, in state or governmental offices, in the banks, everywhere, Muslims who are visibly Muslim and observant Muslims are going through discrimination. What the law will do is to give these practices even more legitimacy. And it goes to the point that if you are an observant Muslim, and if you are conservative, which in itself is not a sin or a crime, right? I mean, civic sin or crime, that will put you at risk. Because these signs of religious observance will be read as signs of uncivility or uncivism. And that's what is really serious here.
So how has it come about, do you think, then Jocelyne, that the French have been convinced to look at Islam and Muslims in this very negative light? You know, as you've pointed out now, these restrictions have been in place for about 2 decades now. I mean, that's worrying because, as I said to you as well, and as you well know, that Muslims are still living there. I mean, there are still Muslim women who wear the hijab. There are still Muslims who would be considered, quote unquote, conservative, but they're still very much part of French society, and I imagine want to be part of French society, as they regularly say as well. So what's to be done of them? I mean, what's the plan?
Unfortunately, there is no real plan. What is worrisome is that this particular targeting of Muslim is unique in the sense that this discourse on religion in public space, on religious practice in the secular French public space, unfortunately involve only Muslim. And this is why it's a problem, because everywhere you have people in their religious tradition who are particularly pious. Does that make them uncivic or bad citizens? This is what I've been saying for a long time. This is a discourse that the French should have. This is a discussion that should involve not only the Muslim leaders, but the Jewish leaders, the Christian leaders, and have a whole discussion on what does it mean to be religious and citizen in French country. The issue is that this is only targeting Muslims. And the more the French do that, the more the frustration grows among the French youth, the Muslim youth, and the more the discourse of radical global movement is attractive to them. And I think it's a vicious circle in which the French, unfortunately, especially in their political elite, are not ready to get out or to break.
And on that point that you just made there, it's an important one, right? Because hatred or prejudice, or however we want to term what's happening here towards Muslims, will not remain limited to Muslims, I would imagine. I mean, if we look at history, contemporary and even beyond that in the past, we've always seen that if you have prejudice and bias towards one group, it's very easy to then translate that to other groups as well, right? It's like a wildfire type situation. Do you think that should be of concern then to all religious communities in France?
You're absolutely right. The surveys we have now show that in the last 25 years, the discrimination by state organizations and by governmental groups have been on the rise for Muslims first, but then all other religious groups. The moment the state takes initiative to control a particular religion, it will apply, and it does apply to all the others. Again, this data are there. It is not discussed in the French public space, and that's a very serious political deficit right there. And also, I would say that there is something to do in the civil society about creating a broader discourse among religious groups and creating some kind of cooperation to have a more coherent discourse that is not only Muslims defending themselves against this particular bias. It has to be broader than Muslims themselves. That's what also I have been saying. The more it's only a one way or one discussion between Muslims and French institutions, it does increase the idea that Islam is exceptional.
Right. Okay, we'll have to leave there as a final, Jocelyne, but we do sincerely appreciate your taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us this morning. That was Jocelyne, who was speaking to us this morning from Boston, Massachusetts, sharing her expertise about the relation that Muslims have with their own country, i.e. France. They've been there for generations. They are very much contributing members to society, as much as the narrative is that, they're ghettoized, etc. That ghettoization has not happened in a vacuum. That's a situation that has been brought about. And now this talk of Islamist separatism, as Macron, the French president, says, that's all troublesome, not just for Muslims, of course, as I've spoken to with Jocelyne as well about that. This will translate, and this will move on then to other religious groups who should be viewing any such bill that is set to pass in France with a lot of worry, because this will not just target Muslims. This will one day in the near future, God forbid, of course, target other religious groups as well for their respective values and religious practices as well. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this step, we're going to discuss white supremacy within the United States. Now, the Department of Homeland Security has come out with its first annual Homeland Threat Assessment, and within that, it says that white supremacists will remain the deadliest domestic terror threat to the U.S. homeland at this point in time. Now, since 2018, white supremacists have been involved in several lethal attacks in the U.S. and have conducted more lethal attacks, in fact, in that country than any other domestic extremist movement. Now, there's also, of course, just the latest first presidential debate that came out. In that, we know there was a huge controversy about Donald Trump not, at least at that point in time, in the debate itself, condemning white supremacy, though he did later on go on to Fox News to condemn such white supremacist groups such as the Proud Boys and many others as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by our esteemed panelist, Dr. Richard Chasdi, who is a professorial lecturer at George Washington University. He's joining us now from Gaithersburg in Maryland. Richard, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of this threat of white supremacy, and whether or not the likes of Donald Trump and others within the establishment are already ready to actually admit that this is a problem and do something about it?
Well, the threat of white supremacy and violent actions in the United States, especially within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, is especially dangerous. And one of the things that we have to think about is what I found unprecedented was that the President of the United States was, in essence, endorsing the Proud Boys when he told in the presidential debate for them to stand down but stand by. So it's and the reaction on the part of the Proud Boys and others was exhilaration. It was just a terrible scene to have to witness. So the issue is that Christopher Wray of the FBI believes this is the most dangerous threat. Members of the intelligence community think this is the most dangerous threat currently facing the United States with regards to terrorism. And this is something that has to be taken seriously. And there's obviously a disconnect between the president and experts in the field in terms of gauging the seriousness of this threat and acting accordingly.
And so, what does it mean when the president and the FBI are on opposite, or the DHS, I should say, pardon me, Department of Homeland Security, are on opposite ends of this issue, right? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is who wins out, whose policy will win out when it comes to dealing with white supremacy? I would imagine that the FBI or DHS and these other intelligence agencies are and have the right to deal with this on their own, or do you think that the president can throw a spanner into all that?
Well, the security agencies can deal with threats, and they do. But the president sets the tone in terms of how particular actions are received on the part of his supporters in particular. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen a spike in hate crimes. And I don't think it's a coincidence that within the context of a calamitous condition such as coronavirus, that we're seeing what I've described as a ad hoc enhanced terrorism, where you have people basically in reaction to the COVID-19 problem beginning to act out either with increased frequency or greater intensity or both. There's a strong link here, I think, between the COVID-19 situation and the white supremacist resurgence. But let's remember, this goes back to the beginning of the Trump administration, where he essentially, during one of the protests here in the United States, said that there were good people on both sides with respect to protesters, to white supremacists and neo-Nazis, and unfortunately to the neo-Nazis and white supremacist movements themselves.
You know, we've been looking at the likes of Boogaloo and stuff, right? And those sorts of groups as well, Richard. You know, with the BLM protest, the Black Lives Matter protest that you know, just recently hit the U.S. again, especially after the killing of George Floyd, there was proof essentially on video that we had apparently a white supremacist, at least in that case, you know, destroying shop windows. And then there was talk about these Boogaloo movement wanting to, in fact, spark a civil war of sorts. That's all extremely dangerous, right? I mean, do you think that this will all be reeled in time?
Well, this is an important point that you raise. You have to think about the environment of terrorism as an interaction between what happens on the left wing of politics and what happens on the right wing of politics. And one of my big concerns has to do with the prospect of terrorist group formation or terrorist group splintering within the context of a COVID-19 condition, where government, for a variety of different reasons, is unable or unwilling to respond to the demands of those who feel, and justifiably so in the United States, that there's tremendous economic, political, cultural inequality, and that in effect it depends on who you are in terms of what your experience in the United States is all about. So I think that one of the issues of concern to me is the prospect of left-wing movements possibly splintering into more extremist groups if, in fact, or certainly the pressure is there, if, in fact, government does not respond in terms of stimulus checks, in terms of working actively to invoke the National Defense Act to provide greater protections for American citizens across the board. This is a question of social equity and justice. And this is a virus that is hitting minority communities in disproportionately high numbers. Yeah. And it's government's responsibility to attend to the demands and aspirations of people from a broad segment of society, and not relegated to the essentially white upper class male way of set of interests. Hmm.
You know, the president, as you well know, Richard, speaks about Antifa, and that is already being, you know, an extreme left terror group, essentially, right? Do you think that there is some legitimate, you know, criticism on his part in that regard? Do you think that there are some on the left who are already very much violent?
I'm not sure that I would call Antifa a terrorist group. It's a loosely organized left-wing extreme movement, and within it, just as within certain right-wing extremist movements like the Boogaloo Boys, you have individuals that do practice terror. But the kind of systemic, sustained terrorist campaigns that you associate with terrorist groups for these political movements as it stands at this moment just isn't there. My concern is what happens if this continues, if we continue in the United States down this path. And of course, the election is going to be the watershed event in terms of whether we do or we don't, with regards to the prospect of terrorist group fragmentation and national a political movement cohesion, because what government can do is make every effort possible to ensure that nonviolent, peaceful groups, and I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter. It's a nonviolent, peaceful political movement, that group coheres, that it stays together and does not fragment. So it's incumbent upon leadership to work with leaders of nonviolent, peaceful movements. And of course, I exclude the right-wing movements from this completely, but that they work with leaders of these movements to ensure a more coordinated set of efforts to respond to the demands of constituents and potential constituent groups.
But then I would think, and the argument is made, of course, and it is an allegation, I would imagine, but it's sometimes there is evidence for it that Donald Trump is the kind of politician, or has come into office very much riding a wave of polarization and divisiveness, right? And not to say that there wasn't some level of divisiveness and polarization before he came to office, but do you think that that also plays into all this, right? Where you have that divide within Americans as well, right? Left, right, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, all those sorts of things that just continues to show a divide upon in some really, really key values and morals for the country?
Well, yes. The flaw of this country is that we have profound racial and ethnic and economic divides, which are divisive in and of itself, and these are structural dimensions of our political landscape. What Donald Trump is what people call an ethnic entrepreneur or a political entrepreneur who gains his power and his influence by means of manipulating anxieties and fears and building this in conjunction with constituents who are also frightened about change and frightened about globalization, for example, and what that means in terms of immigration and what that means in terms of loss of jobs, to stoke the fears that people have about economic and personal security issues. That's what he does, and he's very good at it. But people need to recognize that for what it is. And it is hate-mongering, and it is an accelerant that fans this type of hatred within the context of the COVID-19 condition in particular. And within the context of this, of course, with the killings of George Floyd and the killings of Breonna Taylor and others, and what we're seeing as the systemic racism on the part of law enforcement throughout the country in terms of their attacks against unarmed African Americans, this becomes very, very serious and has the prospect of overwhelming some of the traditional constraints in American society that have ensured that terrorism, as we see in other parts of the world, doesn't gain the same sort of traction in the U.S. as it does, for example, in Europe. The U.S. has a long legacy of terrorism. The Ku Klux Klan, for example, Posse Comitatus, white supremacists group, but this is something that I fear could be rather different and unprecedented if, in fact, conditions continue in this country as they are.
Richard, do you think that and I'm talking about the Democratic Party here, and those who are on the other side can do a better job of reaching out across the aisle, right? Because there has been, and there is sometimes, especially through social media, and even really in the rhetoric of some politicians, really kind of, divisive language, even on the part of the left, right? Where they speak in very derogatory terms sometimes about the other side, make fun of Donald Trump, Melania Trump. I mean, the list really goes on. And of course, there are sometimes condemnations as well when it goes too far. But nevertheless, it feels like the other side is also almost playing into this, right? Where Donald Trump, whether we like him or not and his policies or not, does have an extremely strong support base. And that, I imagine, isn't going anywhere. I mean, the Pandora's box is now open, so the only way you can deal with it is by actually conversing with these people, right?
Well, it's a strong base, but it's a small base. It's around 30%, between 30 and probably a max of 40%, somewhere in there, last I checked. And this is a group that really is committed to Donald Trump, and any sort of discourse is is really not possible. Having said that, the role of civility in terms of the elite in the halls of Congress, for example, have really, you're right, have passed by the wayside. And it's an unfortunate reality that politics in the United States, and indeed in much of the world, is conducted on the extremes in terms of both the right and the left. Gone are the days, for example, where you could have a relationship between Democrats and Republicans, much in the way that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a relationship with Antonin Scalia, and it is very unfortunate that is the case.
Very well, Richard. Well, that is our final word, but we do sincerely appreciate your taking your time out this morning to share your thoughts with us. That was Richard Chasdi speaking to us there from Maryland, sharing his thoughts with us about this report from the Department of Homeland Security, its first annual Homeland Threat Assessment, in which it has clearly laid out that white supremacists are the greatest threat to the United States, domestic terror threat, that is, a threat to its national security as well. So why then would this agency be at such odds with what the U.S. president says and the U.S. administration says about white supremacy? President not even, at least initially, condemning white supremacy. Then later on, when he was called out about it and there was outrage online and throughout the country, he did finally then condemn many of those groups as well. Does this mean he agrees with their ideology? Does this mean he just sees within them a political base, ensuring then that he would get reelected at the end of this year? Of course, those are open questions as well about that. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss a bipartisan bill that's being brought forth in the United States, which would essentially give Israel a veto over U.S. arms sales to the Middle East. And all of this, one should remember, is done within the context of Trump wanting to sell F-35 jets to the UAE. It's also important just to remember today's news that Qatar has, in fact, also put in a request for those F-35 jets as well. So it seems that these countries in this region, the GCC countries especially, are increasingly interested in acquiring those F-35 jets. At least in the case of the UAE, Israel is seemingly against that. And of course, that's not included in the normalization deal, at least the deal that all of us have seen that have been made public, any connection to F-35 or arms sales in general. But then there is, as we know within the U.S., there is this talk about Israel's qualitative military edge always being maintained and the need to always maintain that in that region. What does this then mean going forward, right? Now that we have the normalization between the UAE and Israel, as well as Bahrain and Israel, does that mean that Israel will still want, even though it has these normalization of ties with those two respective countries, a military edge over them, and why? Considering they would now, in some ways, be considered allies, right? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Stephen Leibo, who is a professor of modern international history and politics at Sage College. He's joining us this morning from Albany, New York. Joining us from Clearwater, Florida, is Dr. Bledar Prifti, who is associate professor of political science and is also the author of U.S. Foreign Policy in the Middle East, The Case for Continuity. Bledar and Stephen, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Bledar, let me start with you. What do you make of this bill? Are the concerns that are being brought up by such a bill legitimate, considering this is essentially then having another government tell your government whether or not it's okay with what you are set to do vis-a-vis arms sales?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. Well, we can look at this issue from two main perspectives. One perspective is the political one. So we here in America are in the midst of an election, season, and all of these politicians or congressional representatives who have sponsored or co-sponsored the bill are up for re-election. And I would say or assume that they are kind of catering to the Jewish voters as well. The second perspective, which is more important, has to do with the national security interests of the United States in America, in the Middle East. And to be more precise, the top priority of the U.S. in the Middle East is to prevent the emergence of a dominant power. This is very important because this is key. This is what the main objective of the U.S. is in the Middle East. In his service, of course, we can talk about control over oil resources, human rights, and things like that, but these are all in service of that main objective, to prevent a dominant power from emerging. In this case, this legislation, I read the legislation, and Section 4 of it indeed makes the consultation requirement. It does not indeed gives Israel a veto. However, it mandates that the president consults the Israeli counterparts to basically discuss the bill. The reason why I think they are proposing this bill is because they might be very concerned that President Trump is going too far into supporting the Arab states in this case. So we have seen that with the United Arab Emirates. So now these legislatures are kind of concerned that President Trump might be going too far into helping the Arab states. Why? Because key here is to maintain the balance of power. Of course, there is a need to balance Iran. However, that doesn't mean that there should be an unlimited support given to the Arab states. So I look at it from this perspective. I look at it as an attempt to kind of prevent President Trump from going too far into helping the Arab states.
Stephen, what are your thoughts? Because, there's a lot that we can ask, on the heels of what Bledar just said. If the U.S. doesn't want somebody to come out as the dominant power in the region, whether we like it or not, whichever side of the aisle we may be on this issue, Israel has always been a special partner, as it's called, right, for the U.S. when it comes to the Middle East, and it's always had that military advantage. So in some ways, Israel has been the more powerful one in the region militarily. So why now that you have normalization with these countries, why not allow them to then become strong militarily?
Well, let me put it this way, and I agree in part with what was said a few moments ago, but we have to be realistic. There's always the broad conversation about U.S., Israeli, Middle East relations and things of that sort. But the bottom line is we're in the time, not only, as was just said, the time of an election. We are a month out from an election, and in the time of Trump, where the traditional American foreign policy balances in the Middle East. And it's not just Israel. America's always had very strong relations with the Saudis and other Arab states. But let's just look at what's really going on here. First of all, as it was just said, in large measure, this isn't about anything because it just says consult. There is no veto. The idea of a veto of American foreign policy by a third country is absurd, and it's not there. But what is this really about? It's a single congressman in a Congress of hundreds of people who is, and we all know, Congress people go up for election every 2 years. Congressman Schneider has a position which is clearly precarious. He has both won and lost that position and won it back again. And the Republicans, and this is very much to their credit, have in the very diverse area of what we're talking about in Illinois, come up with a Republican candidate who has a resume that seems much more democratic in the era of the world of the era of women and the effort to get more women in politics. She's a woman. She is deep ties to the Hispanic community, deep ties to South Asia. Her husband is South Asian, incredibly educated. Quite frankly, she looks like a Democratic candidate, not a Republican candidate. Now, if you are a Democratic candidate and you're nervous about the winning, and there's a real reason, he's got a pretty mixed record here, and the other side has a candidate that's going to probably draw a lot of your support. That's what this is about. It clearly is a campaign gimmick that was put out last week by a single congressman on an issue that will attract a reasonable number of level of support, because Israel, and we can talk about that a great deal, has a significant, though often in some ways diminishing and transforming support in the United States. But frankly, I think what we're looking at here is something that has no real substance.
Interesting. Bledar, what do you make of what Stephen there just said? And do you think then, if I may just ask so point blank, do you think that the likes of the UAE and even Qatar, as I said, that was the latest news that's come out, has also requested that it be able to buy the F-35 jets? Do you think that the U.S. should sell these jets to these respective countries?
Well, as I mentioned before, this issue can be viewed from both perspectives. and one is political one, but I think that the most important perspective is a national security perspective, meaning that here with the bill, we have an expression of the Israelis' concern, in addition to Americans' concerns, that America is going probably too far into helping the Arab states. You mentioned that Israel is very powerful. That is very true. Israel is also a nuclear power. However, Israel cannot expand in the region. Why? Because Israel does not have the population, does not have soldiers, boots on the ground to expand. So that's why Israel is a geostrategic ally of the US. Every small nation around the world is an ally of the United States, and every power that seeks to expand is an enemy of the United States of America. So that's what guides US foreign policy in this case, the concern that Israelis and Americans also have that President Trump might be going too far into helping the Arabs, which later might, go against the U.S. interest. You never know that. So they need to kind of be very kind of cautious about this help with the Arab states, because on the other side you have Iran. So America is kind of trying to play the chess game to balance both sides. Israelis, they are not a real threat to the U.S. because they cannot expand. They cannot threaten U.S. interests because it can be balanced easily. But the other two are kind of hard to balance.
Stephen, if I may ask, and I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a moment, do you think that maybe just the U.S. is just too involved in the Middle East? I mean, that's the feeling I'm getting, right? That if the U.S. is trying to play this balancing act, I mean, this is all very difficult, a chess game. Should the U.S. even be this involved in the region and trying to balance Iran with the other powers? I mean, why not let the region and the regional countries deal with all of the above on their own?
Certainly a core part of the Republican heritage is this connection with their identity as Christian. And Christianity's origins in Palestine and the Middle East, and this incredibly strong identity, particularly always remember, and yes, we can have a larger conversation about American national security concerns, but we're living in the time of Trump. And what Trump has done, and there's nothing really subjective about this, is he has always played to his base. This is a core issue in terms of the election. He never tries to go beyond his base. And this is more unusual. Trump has taken that same perspective and floated out into American foreign policy. For example, one hears, and there's a reasonable conversation about the role of Jews relative to Israel and Israeli support. But of course, Trump knows that the vast majority of American Jews always vote Democratic. But Trump's base, and that's where he never goes beyond, the Jews are not his base, are Christian Zionists. And these are Christian Zionists whose understanding of Palestine is the first century Palestine before the rise of Islam, before Arabs arrived from the south into the area of Palestine. And for them, Zionism isn't about the contemporary world of Israel and the Middle East, as all of us understand. It is about the role of Zionism in bringing about the second coming of Christ.
Right.
That's why we have seen Trump, in the same way that he abandoned the Kurds, though for different reasons, largely abandoned the Palestinians because they're not part of, shall we say, the worldview of that chunk of his base that cares about the Middle East. And then, of course, on the other side, America's modern strength was built on cheap petroleum in large measure, particularly in the later part of the 20th century, that often came from the Middle East.
Exactly.
So the idea that the United States, whether it's appropriate or not, should be part of the Middle East it's kind of a moot point.
Yeah.
And in fact, and I think we all understand that for a long time, Middle Eastern people saw the French and the British as the outsiders who were intervening, the whole mandate system. But it was America that was seen as something of a more honest broker, even in the context of the Palestinian-Israeli situation. But we're right now a month away from an election in the era of Trump. And I think we have to put aside the larger geopolitical issues for the moment, because that's what's driving what happens right now, is that election and the needs of one individual.
All right, Bledar, I'll give you the word before I let both of you go. Even if this is all to be seen within the context of domestic U.S. politics, right? This does and will, I mean, if such a bill were to pass, I'm saying, or any similar such measures would be taken, this would have ramifications for the Middle East, right? So, I mean, in that sense, what I asked Stephen is, what I meant to ask, I think, was, do you think that this will just further American involvement in the region, in the sense that America would still very much, even though Donald Trump keeps saying, and even Obama before him had said, we want to lessen our involvement in the region, this in fact just continues it?
Well, to your point, I agree that America is too much involved in the Middle East, and it should not. It should not. And in this case, and I also disagree with Stephen in this case, I don't think that this is more about religion. I think it's about national security interest of the U.S. The U.S. was not the one to support Israel, the establishment of Israel. Of course, we voted, we recognized Israel. However, we started supporting Israel after the Six-Day War, when we realized that Israel was a major power in the Middle East, in that region. That's the main reason what guides this geostrategic relation with Israel. And the second, I agree that this kind of arm deals may make America more involved in the Middle East, but it can be easily undone by, following a policy that kind of looks at the Middle East from outside in kind of trying to keep the balance of power. So in this case, the strategy that I would kind of mention here is buck passing. So to allow the other, the regional states to balance each other, and for America to intervene only when the balance of power is kind of disturbed. So the bottom line, I agree that America is too much involved in the Middle East, but I do not, agree that it is about religion. Indeed, if you look at the constituents of the Republican Party, I don't think that they would agree with what President Trump, has been doing, or the support that he has been giving to Israel. So I think this is more about U.S. national interest. Of course, it has a political flavor into it, because now we are in the midst of an election season, and all of these, congressional representatives, they are up for re-election. So that's also a reason as well, a factor, but not as dominant as the other one.
Okay, we'll have to leave there as a final word. Appreciate both Stephen and Bledar for putting into context all of this, and essentially both agreeing that this has probably more of a domestic, angle to it than not. And, there's disagreement, of course, about a religious angle or a national security angle. And all of that, of course, goes to show that any such decisions about Israel are a lot more complex than maybe we appreciate them to be. Nevertheless, the ramifications are very real on the ground. The Qataris and Emiratis want F-35 jets. That's a reality. The Israelis do not want, at least in the context of the UAE, they haven't yet reacted to the best of my knowledge about Qatar's request, do not want the UAE to have those F-35 jets because, again, Israel must have qualitative military edge, and that must be maintained in this region, at least according to the U.S. establishment, as well as the Israeli establishment, seemingly agreements, quote unquote. And when it comes to this bill that I spoke about, yes, both guests mentioned that Israel doesn't actually technically have a veto within it, but nevertheless, it's given priority, and it continues, as I mentioned to our guests as well, American involvement in the Middle East, something which president after president continues saying they do not want to continue American military involvement in the Middle East because it's just simply too much of a headache. They're so far away, they're trying to keep themselves involved in the region, solve the region's issues, quote unquote, but seem to only be creating more, considering they're not from the region. So why not let the region deal with its own issues, as I put to our guests as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.